Children, it's time to go to bed. Here comes old Jeffrey, a man among the dead. If you stay up even for a snack, he will show up with his dreadful whack.
In the dead of winter 1716, in a rectory half buried in frost and snow, the Reverend Samuel Wesley was awakened by loud bangs. He knew that it wasn't an impatient every delivery driver, however, as this wasn't the first time that the house had been tormented by an unseen force. He took up a candle, its flame trembling, and shouted into the emptiness of his own home, "Thou deaf and dumb devil, why dost thou fright these children who cannot answer for themselves? Come to me in my study, that I am a man." The silence that followed felt endless. Then came a reply so violent it almost split the door frame. The sound echoed down the hall, through the nursery where his daughters slept, through the brick bones of the house itself. Somewhere the family mastiff whimpered and hid like it was being stared down by something truly disturbing. Then, nothing. That was the night the Wesleys stopped pretending the noises were tricks or trespassers, and it was the night that old Jeffrey announced himself. I'm Bleaky, and today I'm going to tell you one of the oldest cases of a haunting in UK history, which happened at Epworth Rectory. Phantom knocks, groans, and footsteps stalked the house until the spirit finally revealed how truly bitter and twisted he had become.
I want such children, it's time to go to bed. Here comes old Jeffrey, a man among the dead.
The year was 1716, George I is on the throne, and the flatbeds of Lincolnshire lay quietly beneath a winter sky. A mile from the Market Road, the Epworth Parsonage, as it was known back then, stood against the fields, sturdy, respectable, the home of the Reverend Samuel Wesley, his wife Susanna, and enough children to fill a church pew by themselves. Yep, before Netflix and chills, there was just chills. Two of the boys, John and Charles, would one day shape the spiritual life of Britain. For now, though, they are just simply children of a religious, disciplined household, raised on scripture, Latin, and a strict timetable that would even make a trained conductor quit. It was the kind of house in which noises should mean something simple: wind in the chimney, a servant's footstep, or a kettle shifting from its lid. Well, that's what they told themselves until the winter of 1716, when the activity became impossible to dismiss. But to grasp the full story of the Wesleys, we have to start 7 years earlier with a very different kind of horror, a devastating fire. In February 1709, the Wesleys' original thatched rectory caught fire in the middle of the night and burnt to the ground. The family barely escaped. At one window, a small boy, John, aged just 6, was spotted surrounded by flame. A neighbour stood on another man's shoulders and lifted him out a heartbeat before the roof collapsed in on the house. John would remember that rescue forever, quoting Zachariah's phrase, "a brand plucked from the burning," and believing that the fire had some kind of meaning. The blaze left scars that weren't just psychological. Reverend Wesley had enemies in the parish. He was an outspoken Tory and a strict moralist, and the village believed that one of these enemies set the house on fire out of some kind of revenge. Rebuilding Epworth Parsonage was expensive, and determined to prevent the same thing happening again, or at least give them a better chance of extinguishing the fire or keeping people out, he decided to replace the timber and thatched roof with brick and stone. The new rectory was designed to be a place of grandeur, to show everyone how rich the family was, but in truth, it racked up a debt that would press on the family for years. By 1716, the new rectory was the proud centre of their life, but the household was scattered. The three eldest sons, Samuel Jr., John and Charles, were away at boarding school in London. At home, Susanna ran the household with lessons, chores and prayers, supported by her daughters and servants. Because of this, when the disturbances first began, it was the women and servants of the household who witnessed them first. At first, Samuel dismissed the earlier rumours as childish fancy. When the noises continued, however, he suspected local pranksters, men who resented his politics and wanted to mess with him and the family. He also started blaming young men who he believed were sneaking around with his daughters, hiding in the shadows until they could meet with them. This dude might be a little bit paranoid. Meanwhile, Susanna believed something else. An old folk story that if many people heard a haunting and one person didn't, the one who heard nothing was marked for death. Since Samuel's the only member of the family who had heard nothing, she worried that the Reaper had her husband in his sights. To reassure them or to face any prowlers, Samuel brought home a large mastiff, but the plan backfired. When the knocks came, the dog cowered, whimpered, crawling under furniture as if the unseen entity had teeth. What did they expect? Even Scooby-Doo is terrified of ghosts, and hunting Spooky Dookies is his job. The activity became a major talking point in the rectory, and the daughters half joked that the entity was called Old Jeffrey, but as they would eventually find out, it was no joking matter. On December 2nd, 1716, at just before 10, servant Robert Brown and a maid were sitting by the dying fire when a firm knock rapped on the garden door. Brown opened it and looked out into the frosty dark, but no one was there, so he simply closed the door. The knocking suddenly started again, this time even louder. He quickly swung the door open to find the night empty. As he scanned the darkness, he heard a loud groan, the kind of sound a man makes during a painful death, or how I sound when the mortgage is due. It sounds like Mr. Turpine, Brown muttered, who was an acquaintance of the family who often made similar groans when his back ached. But the thing is, Mr. Turpine wasn't outside. No one was. He bolted the door and went up to the garret stairs. Halfway to the top, he stopped to see a small hand mill used for grinding grain, whirling on its spindle with no one actually using the tool. As he stepped closer, fear gripping him, the spindle suddenly stopped. Later, Brown tried to make light of it, saying if it had been full of malt, he might have ground his hand out for me, meaning that if the spindle was actually grinding grain, he would have used it to do his work. But his joke was just a bandage, as deep down, he was scared. Later that night, as he got comfy in his bed, he reached over and snuffed out his candle. As he began to fall asleep, he was suddenly awoken by the sound of a cock gobble. And no, I don't mean the 18th century equivalent of Bonnie Blue sneaking into his room, but the sound of a turkey cock making its gobbling sound. Cue goblin sound. Thank you. Brown quickly relit his candle and looked around the room, but no turkey had somehow wandered in. At that moment, he heard the sound of stumbling coming from somewhere downstairs and suspected a prankster. Brown ran down the stairs, but the house was eerily quiet. By morning, the tale had spread. One maid laughed and said, "I defy anything to frighten me," something that the entity took as a challenge. That evening, after churning butter, she carried a train to the dairy. That's when knocks began on the shelf above her head, then below, as if to herd her out to the room. Frantic, she used her candle to look around, but there was nothing there to make the sounds. The knocking then became even louder and sharper, forcing the terrified woman to run out, with the butter and tray crashing to the ground. The noises weren't constant in just a few places, however. They circulated, a knock here, a rattle there, as if old Jeffrey was patrolling the entire building. Molly Wesley, about 20, sat reading in the dining room when the hall door opened and something rustled. The specific sound of silk brushing along the floorboards. Frozen in fear, Molly couldn't do anything but listen to the presence circling her chair before it walked to the door. Molly began to compose herself and nervously called out, "It signifies nothing to flee." Clearing her throat, she then screamed, "Whatever it is, it can run faster than I." Later, she told her mother Susanna, who was affectionately called Suki. Suki scoffed and said, "I would fain see what would frighten me." At that, something knocked under the table, with the latch on it lifting and falling to the ground. The woman, who was previously brave, had now dived into bed, fully clothed, and refused to look till morning. Hetty waited on the landing with her father's candle one night and heard footsteps above her, slow and heavy, crossing the garret, descending the back stairs, pacing back up the stairs, then shaking the ceiling. She told Amelia, who went by the nickname Nancy, who volunteered to investigate the strange goings-on. That night, she followed the sound to the kitchen, where it drummed on the walls on whichever side she wasn't on. Then, it suddenly started banging on the back door. She quickly unlocked it, threw it wide open, but once again, no one was there. When she pushed it shut, however, something violently slammed it back into her shoulder. She then forced it closed with a feeling of resistance coming from the other side. She fought against the force until she eventually managed to shut and lock it. Now she was convinced, whatever this was, it wasn't a prank. Now, Susanna was known for her level-headedness. If she believed anything, it was in order. She had held the house together through the fire, debts, and mixed feelings towards them from the parish. She wouldn't easily give in to fairy tales. When her daughters burst into the room and begged her to listen in the nursery, she agreed, calm but a little stern. From a bare corner, she heard the sound that she instantly recognised, the rocking of a cradle. The thing is, there hadn't been a cradle in that room for years. She kept listening to the rhythm of the rocking, wood on wood, the sound of a ghost child sleeping. She knelt and prayed, and later she wrote that she begged the spirit not to disturb the family anymore. That night she told Samuel what had happened, but instead of showing compassion, he became angry. He screamed, "Suki, I am ashamed of you. These boys and girls frighten one another. You are a woman of sense." He then ordered her to drop the subject. Well, that gaslighting's about to come back and kick him in the balls. On a later evening, at around 6, the family gathered for prayers. When Samuel reached the intercession, bless our sovereign Lord King George, a sharp knock echoed through the room. At our men, a thunderous rock shook the room, described as like a smith's hammer on a board. The pattern repeated morning and evening after that. King, knock. Amen, bang. From this moment, old Geoffrey seemed to become more conversational with the family in a way. He circled rooms to avoid people trying to get too close to where he was standing, and also started mimicking the rector's style of door knock when he was sitting in his study. It seemed to be most powerful between 9 and 10 at night, which led the daughters to tell each other, "Shh, Geoffrey is coming. It's time to sleep." And if that gives any parents out their ideas, I don't suggest getting your kids to go to bed by knocking around. The later therapy bill will not be worth it. Family life understandably became stressful. Eventually the rector called a neighbour, Reverend Mr. Hoole of Haxey, to witness the haunting just to make sure he wasn't going nuts. Between 9 and 10, a servant whispered, "Old Geoffrey is coming. I hear him," after hearing a saw-like creak in the northeast corner of the house. Then the violent knocking started, moving towards the religious men. They quickly checked on the girls and saw them all asleep, sweating and trembling, as if even in their dreams, Geoffrey was there. Seeing how much distress his children were in, Samuel finally snapped. He pulled out his pistol, but Huell caught his arm. "Sir, you are convinced this is supernatural. You cannot hurt it. You may give it power to hurt you." Samuel lowered the pistol and screamed into the air, "Thou deaf and dumb devil, why dost thou fright these children? Come to me in my study, that I am a man." Well, it seems old Geoffrey is happy to oblige, as 3 huge knocks rang out, which made the floorboards below them shake. The next evening, when Samuel opened his study door, it suddenly thrust back at him, with enough force to throw him back, caused him to fall down on the cold floorboards. While being physically attacked scared him, what made him tremble was what he thought he saw for a split moment between the crack in the door as he tried to open it. A tall man that appeared to have a grotesque smile. The haunting carried on through December into January. There were quiet nights with just tapping on the bed, which was the girl's hint that it was time to go to sleep. Then there were the loud nights. On one of the latter, just after Samuel and Susanna lay down, there were 3 heavy blows, then 3 more, as if someone struck the oak chest by the bed with a cane. When Samuel got up, candle in hand, a sound like silver coins poured down the stairs, then the clattering sound of metal hitting the bottles under the stairs, loud enough to wake the entire house, but not strong enough to break any of the bottles. The mastiff, who was usually brave in normal circumstances, whimpered and hid before the first noises even were heard, as if he had seen old Geoffrey before we started the activity. Friends of the family told Samuel that they must leave the house immediately, but the stubborn pastor refused. "Let the devil flee from me. I will never flee from the devil." And then, as suddenly as it began, it appeared that Geoffrey just gave up trying to claim the house as his. In the last days of January 1717, The knocks died down to sporadic taps and then to nothing, as if the spirit had been feasting on the fear of the family, but when they stopped being scared of him, he'd no longer have the juice to torment the household. Eventually, a letter was sent to the eldest son at the boarding school, simply stating that the disturbances were over. No culprit was ever caught, no trick exposed, and no natural cause was discovered. What puzzled everyone was how the knocking could shoot from the ceiling to the floor or the wall to another side of the wall, even when everyone was accounted for. On paper, they were simply a respectable, educated family that had lived 2 months in a house, then knocked back. After February 1717, life in the rectory became calm. Yet even in the silence, the memory of the haunting changed the house. The Wesleys decided to record everything that had happened, just so the facts were not twisted or misremembered over time. It turned into a family story, one that was told carefully and accurately, with dates, rooms, and from people who found the stories embarrassing to share, but were raised to honour the truth. Decades after the haunting, John Wesley took the family account and wrote the story to send to the Arminian magazine. It reads like a case file written by a pastor, dry, precise, and careful not to claim more than what the evidence showed. Instead of describing flaming eyes or full-body apparitions being seen throughout, which was common at the time, he described the strange knocks, steps, and subtle activity. Even when Samuel thought he had saw a fleeting sight of old Geoffrey, it wasn't embellished and was communicated more as a trick of the eye. But why did the haunting begin in the first place? Well, some say it started long before the first knock was ever heard. Nearly 15 years earlier, Samuel and Susanna Wesley had a nasty argument about the royal prayer, a domestic agreement that became, in hindsight, a potential reason why old Geoffrey got so angry. As rector of Epworth, Samuel Wesley was loyal to the Church of England and the reigning monarch. During family devotions around 1701, he prayed, as was customary, for King William III. But when he reached the words, "Our Sovereign Lord," Susanna refused to say Amen. She quietly explained that she didn't consider William as the rightful ruler. In fact, she believed that James II should be their king. 18th century drama. Samuel wasn't happy and told his wife that they must split up, telling her, "If we have 2 kings, we must have 2 beds." He left the rectory soon after and stayed away for months, only returning when King William died the following year. I've got a feeling that old Sammy wanted her out the bed so King Willie could jump in. It was that long-settled argument that took on new meaning in December 1716 when the Epworth Rectory began to shake with unexplained noises. As the bangs happened when Samuel was making his prayers to the king, it appeared to be connected. Among the many explanations whispered around Epworth Rectory, one of the most shared was that old Geoffrey had once been alive and lived in the house. Long before the knocks and footsteps began, the Wesleys were said to have employed a servant named Geoffrey, an old man who had lived and died in their service. No one knows exactly how this man died, but it's said it was natural. The thing is, no record of his burial survives, but the story took firm root among the locals. A faithful servant who, even in death, is hell-bent on following his master's instructions, even if that faith had become warped somewhere along the line, maybe upset that the pastor went back to the woman after he disrespected the previous king. After Samuel's death in 1735, Susanna lived on for 7 more years. The rectory passed through other hands until in the 20th century, the World Methodist Council stepped in. In 1954, restoration began, and for a time, to pay its way, the old rectory opened as a bed and breakfast. Guests even slept under the Whitney quilt, a blanket once used by John Wesley himself. Yeah, I'm sure that's going to do wonders for the reviews. The knockings were a bit annoying, bed was comfy, but the blanket smelt of 300-year-old trumps. 1 star. Today, the house is a museum, guided tours, period furnishings, letters in cases. The dining room looks as if the family had just gotten up and left. Or maybe it's been kept in the way that Geoffrey prefers. Compared to the 8-week haunting between 1716 and 1717, modern accounts have been much rarer. A visitor writing for a Haunted History Lincolnshire blog post described how he attended a private night tour and felt the temperature drop in the nursery while the rest of the house felt warm. In the attic, which was once a servant's room, he also claimed that the display lights began to dim, then brighten even more than they originally were. After telling the guide, they had no explanation, claiming it could be faulty bulbs, or maybe the lingering spirit of old Geoffrey, desperately trying to sap enough energy to make himself known again. A common account is the bangs and moans coming from the higher rooms, while others have also experienced the sudden temperature drop in the nursery. One disturbing witness account claims that they saw an old man holding a cane in the garden who faded into nothing. But of course, there's a chance that this has just been fabricated using the original haunting as inspiration. Over the years, several explanations have been put forward for what the Wesleys experienced at Epworth Rectory. Some suggested that it was all a prank, maybe carried out by one of the daughters or a mischievous servant hoping to frighten the others. Yet the noises often came from parts of the house that were locked, or at times where every member of the household was present and accounted for. It seemed unlikely that anyone could have sustained such a trick for months without being caught. Others blamed the structure itself, rats in the wall, loose beams, or air currents shifting through the brickwork. But that doesn't explain why the knocks appeared to respond to speech or prayers, or why they moved quickly from room to room. Samuel himself blamed on the natural noises from the house settling in the cold or the wind, but we know how that turned out. Of course, there was the political theory, hinting at retaliation from the villagers who disliked Reverend Wesley's outspoken Tory views and strict sermons. With that being said, the rectory stood in isolation in open fields, and no intruder was ever seen or heard running away or hiding in the house, which makes the idea of the long-running hoax pretty unlikely. Modern researchers have considered psychological explanations, pointing to the family's stress after the fire, the weight of debt, and the rector's strict household rules. Under such strain, shared tension could easily amplify ordinary sounds into something more terrifying, creating a kind of mass hysteria. Still, for a family so educated and methodical, the fact that they never changed their story or took anything back makes the theory likely up to a point. What really interests me about the Epworth Rectory haunting is not only because it's one of the oldest documented cases of a full-blown haunting, but also because of how the family recorded the activity, how it occurred during a time when a religious man claiming paranormal activity would have put him under fire, and how the activity wasn't exaggerated with demonic blazing eyes or ghostly hands floating around. It just feels very matter of fact, and they even tried to ignore it at one point. John Wesley wouldn't have wanted a haunted church, he wanted a holy one. But he was honest enough to admit that the holy and evil can sometimes share walls. So if you find yourself visiting the old rectory, just don't do anything silly, like discuss the king, because unlike his brother, you may start sweating when you hear the 3 loud bangs around you. While not much activity has been reported in the last century, you never know, old Jeffrey might still be listening. Thanks for watching, guys. Please help me out by hitting the subscribe button, giving the video a like, and ringing the notification bell. And until next time, sleep well, friends.